So group therapy is really interesting, right? It kind of creates its own unique set and setting.
Cannabis truly is a pharmacy and a flower.
Survival comes with cooperation.
Pleasure is healing.
You're being a warrior of the weird.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Elizabeth Nielson about her journey creating peer-reviewed research about psychedelic therapies. It's a large field, but it's still growing as we learn more about addiction, mood disorders, and PTSD. She's a compassionate practitioner and enthusiastic researcher of this burgeoning craft. Dr. Nielson also co-founded Fluence, which provides training and knowledge for people who want to learn about the many aspects of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So if you're curious about how all this research gets done, what psychedelic integration looks like in a group therapy setting, or how we can learn from each other about this type of healing, I know you'll enjoy this conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Nielson. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today with Dr. Elizabeth Nielson. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Lex.
Now you are a psychologist working in some of the hottest stuff in psychology, but I was wondering, when you were younger, what was it you first wanted to be?
A psychologist.
That's great. How young were you when you knew?
I was probably about 15 or 16. And really, I didn't fully understand what that meant. But what I did understand was that some of the people that were like mentors to me in my community and people that I really just sort of admired the way that they conducted themselves in the world, they were psychologists and they were therapists. And that, I think, is what really initially inspired me to pursue finding out more about the field, and that it might be an interesting way for me to spend my life.
And so once you jumped into it in university, did it just keep making sense?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, undergraduate psychology is, I honestly didn't find most of it that particularly interesting, but I was doing a degree in art at the same time. And so that kind of kept me going. That's what really I was much more passionate about at the time. And I was doing my degree in undergraduate psychology, and it was interesting, and I was doing well. But I didn't really start to think about what I would do with psychology professionally until I got to graduate school. I was lucky enough to be at the New School and do a master's degree in substance use counseling, substance use treatment within the psychology department. And there I was really exposed to what were some of the most cutting edge ideas at the time in harm reduction and more empirically supported treatments, and some really forward thinking folks about the nature of mental health and how we might more effectively and more compassionately engage with people who are suffering. And that really inspired me to continue to figure out what I could do as far as making a career in the field. But it was a very long story and a very long trajectory from there to actually starting to work in psychedelic research, probably around 10 years after my master's degree.
Just to follow up a little bit on harm reduction, it was cutting edge and controversial then. How has it been to watch it become more mainstream? And do you still get some pushback when you go to more mainstream psychology gatherings?
That's a good question. Let's kind of start with the beginning of it. To me, it felt like the most natural fit, and the only thing that I would have gone into working with and gone into studying. So I was there because it was harm reduction. I wasn't something that was sort of introduced to me as an alternative to an existing way of working. And maybe that's just, the luck of being where I was at the time. But I don't think if I had been presented with a curriculum of study of a different type of model or a different way of understanding that I would have taken to it so well. So yes, it definitely was, but I could definitely see that it was a switch from the way that things were thought through and things were approached in a lot of more traditional settings, and then leaving that master's degree program and going to work in some more traditional addiction treatment settings, I was really able to see the difference, and I think from there gleaned even more motivation to work towards finding better and more compassionate treatments. Um, I mean, that's a sort of a a vague story summing up like a 7-year trajectory. But I think there's a couple things happening now in terms of harm reduction. I know that it has gotten more acceptable as an addiction treatment approach, certainly since I was first exposed to it and first studying it. And I'm really glad for that. We still have a tremendously long way to go. I don't think that it's really a leading way of thinking about addiction and about addiction treatment, or about how we can, as clinicians, work with people who use drugs in any capacity. Now, what we've done in the psychedelics world is to really draw on a basis in harm reduction psychotherapy or harm reduction informed therapeutic practices, clinical practices, and use those in a model of working with people who are using psychedelics in any, for any set of motivations or any reasons or in any context. And I can kind of tell you a little bit more about that later, but that's really where the harm reduction piece has landed for me at this point.
And so did that help draw you towards a PhD in clinical psychology where you really got to study and use scientific method to find best practices?
Yeah, I didn't really know entirely what I wanted to do, and PhDs are great if you don't entirely know what you want to do because they take so long to finish that even if you do know what you want to do, it'll probably be different by the time you're done. And also, they, by virtue of what they are, they can open a lot of doors and they can put you in a place to do a really wide variety of things. So, what I knew about myself was that I wanted to have a lot of variety of things that I could do, and I wanted to be able to contribute to actually researching and finding and documenting and writing about, and figuring out how to implement better ways of working with people. So that made the PhD level education really the best fit for me. I talked to a lot of people that are considering, what to do about going into the field, going into psychology, becoming a therapist, coming into, saying, oh, I want to get into psychedelic therapy or be a psychedelic therapist. And oftentimes the conversation doesn't end with, well, it's time to go do a PhD, because there are a lot of other alternatives, and I think that you really want to match that to what your needs and circumstances are. But for me, it made the most sense, and by the time I was finishing, the psychedelic therapy research really was just sort of beginning to be something that was happening again, in a way that there were studies going on and teams that people were joining. And so around the time I was getting licensed, that's when things were really starting to ramp up. MAPS was really starting to ramp up their work. And I was able to finish my postdoc and licensure work, focusing my postdoctoral studies really on psychedelic research and therapy.
Wow, what timing. So you just got to step
Yeah.
off the PhD onto the floating bubble going up.
Yeah, it was rather serendipitous, I could say, but I think that it wasn't random at the same time. The things that I had studied leading into that really were necessary for the kind of work that I was doing in psychedelic research and therapy early on, especially having that really strong background in addiction studies, addiction research, addiction treatment, practice experience, as well as another piece of my puzzle had for a long time been mindfulness-based interventions, and those lent themselves very well to understanding how to work with non-ordinary states of consciousness in a therapeutic context. There aren't a whole lot of therapeutic models within the the collection, the very broad collection of therapies that are developed out there, there aren't a whole lot that specifically work with non-ordinary states of consciousness, but mindfulness therapies do.
And so, what was it like for you to switch gears into doing research on psilocybin for alcohol dependence and MDMA for PTSD? What was that like?
Honestly, Lex, it made perfect sense to me. It didn't feel like a stretch or something that was so far out of the box. I was familiar with the history. I was familiar with, the basic theoretical models of how these experiences might help someone who is struggling with addiction, or someone who is struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. And based on, the background that I had and the skills that I had, this kind of research made a lot of sense for me and was a good fit. Um, I think there are a lot of ways that people come into this field, and many people come into it with, especially now, being particularly fascinated by the existing psychedelic research and the existing literature, the experiences that they've read about and seen. Um, I didn't have that as an inspiration so much. I was familiar with, the history and the history of use in clinical research. I should specify that particular piece of it that was, I think, missing from a lot of people's just education and knowledge base. I was really happy to see it being revived. I thought it was a very promising potential therapy. So while a lot of people kind of, and I got this too really early on, the sort of like skeptical looks from some of my colleagues, maybe some of my senior colleagues in more traditional settings. It felt like a very natural thing for me to be exploring, and I want to quantify that with saying, I was working on major FDA approved research studies at leading institutions. So this wasn't I wasn't starting sort of with something that might have been, outside the box in terms of its ways of, not working within the confines of our established research system. I was definitely working within that system. I was, it was completely part of the clinical research field from the beginning.
And so, what was it like to get down to brass tacks to actually watch these sessions happen once you were there and administering and being a therapist for them, to see people using psilocybin and MDMA?
It's a different experience. I think it's one of those things that we we might really be at a loss to describe to therapists who haven't been through these sessions. I'll give you a couple of parameters. The sessions can look a little bit different depending on what, this is just sort of speaking very generally, can look a little bit different depending on what the particular investigational drug or investigational compound is that's being studied. But in general, the sessions that are done in research settings involve usually two therapists being there with the person the whole day. Our study participants using eye shades and headphones to turn their experience inward to really focus on their internal process. And the therapists being there in a role to support that person. Oftentimes that means supporting people with your silent presence. And again, I mentioned mindfulness-based therapies before, but that's one of the places where you see some similarity in that in those approaches, you really learn the value of just being present with someone and sitting with them and supporting them through whatever their internal experience is, in silence, without needing to interrupt, interject, fix, correct, etc. Whatever it is that they're experiencing. And I think that by and large the same goes for a lot of the psychedelic sessions. And again, I'm speaking in a sort of general way because the parameters of specific sessions are going to be specific to the research study, the molecule or investigational drug that is being researched, the indication for which it's being researched. So there's just a lot of variables, and I can't go into all the minutia details of those between the different studies. But in general, that idea of supporting someone with your presence, even if it's not through verbal engagement all day, is really, I think, a key element.
You also train other psychologists in how to hold space for psychedelics. And I was wondering if there were some unique challenges there, especially with the legality of someone experiencing it for themselves.
We are offering some training in ketamine assisted therapy for therapists to provide ketamine assisted psychotherapy, because that's something that therapists in certain settings can find avenues to engage with legally in ways that are aligned with their licensure and their jurisdiction. We're not educating clinicians right now at Fluence on psilocybin assisted therapy or MDMA assisted therapy or anything specifically using compounds that are where there wouldn't be a legal avenue for them to use that in their practice. We hope to be providing those that kind of education when there is a legal avenue for therapists to use it. But right now, what we're focused on is education in psychedelic integration therapy, which means drawing on that harm reduction model and coming under that harm reduction umbrella and training therapists on how they can engage with people who are considering using psychedelics, making decisions about using psychedelics, maybe around safety, reducing risk, setting intentions, things like that. And then afterward, maybe about incorporating those experiences into the larger stream of psychotherapy, maybe about reducing distress after distressing experiences, or building positive experiences into more lasting change and things like that. So that really falls under the psychedelic integration therapy model, which is a harm reduction approach to working with people who use psychedelics in other settings. So it does not include administering psychedelics.
So, at CV Sciences, we've been perfecting our immune support formula for quite a while. And now it's time for the big reveal. It's called CV Acute. It's actually CBD free, and it's very different from typical immune products. CV Acute comes in a small bottle containing just enough for 3 servings per day for 3 days. It's for when you're just starting to feel off, or when you're in a situation where you might not be able to social distance, like on an airplane. CV Acute is based on a famous prescription from Chinese medicine. It combines the fruit of the forsythia, the root of the Baikal skullcap, and the flower of the honeysuckle. The World Health Organization has studied this formula and called it one of the leading seasonal support formulas on the planet. So how does it work? I'm glad you asked, because I spent days and days and days researching that question. I never knew much about traditional Chinese medicine, mostly because as a biochemist, it was too damn complicated. Hundreds of plants combined in thousands of different preparations. It's exactly what makes a reductionist scientist throw up their hands in horror. If you look up forsythia, for instance, in traditional Chinese medicine, it's included in 114 different preparations and prescriptions, and it's been used for over 4,000 years. It's often referred to as one of the 50 fundamental herbs in traditional Chinese medicine. And when studying it, scientists have found over 200 different compounds inside with a wide range of positive effects. Just look up forsythia, honeysuckle, and Baikal skullcap to see a flood of information. So whenever you think your immune system might be getting a challenge from something, take CV Acute and spend 3 days kicking some ass. Use the coupon code Lex Files at cvsciences.com to try CV Acute for immune support. That's Lex Files at cvsciences.com for your bottle of CV Acute. It seems pretty fascinating that your two interests align like that, because harm reduction is often by itself, and people think of the quote unquote bad drugs, and then psychedelics is over here on the good drug side, and both those terms are kind of awful in their way, and they're seen as being on two different sides of the spectrum. And I really think it's fascinating that you're saying people are using these plant medicines and psychedelics out in the world, and they're coming to us to talk. So What's it like for you to be talking to people who are going underground for these rituals and training the therapists who are talking to those people?
So, I mean, I think that's a really interesting statement you just made. Like, we think about harm reduction for the quote unquote bad drugs, and many people in your audience might not put psychedelics in that category and think, well, why would we want to do harm reduction around that? But we need to. I think need to recognize that there are realistically some very important potential harms to consider with psychedelics, um, especially given the fact that people may be accessing them through underground channels, and not through a system where there is some oversight, some recourse should they be hurt or something like that. So really what was occurring for me and for Ingmar prior to us beginning this program was we were working as harm reduction psychotherapists, and people would come to us and they would have been struggling after an experience, and maybe they tried to talk to their therapist about it, or they had tried to talk to another therapist about it, or other healthcare providers, and they just weren't met with understanding. Sometimes they were met with judgment. Sometimes they were shamed. Sometimes they were judged. Sometimes the provider just didn't really know what was going on or how to have a conversation about it. And so we, recognize that just by being able to bring a harm reduction approach and including, respecting these people's autonomy and respecting their decision-making process, we could actually, be of quite a bit of help in a lot of cases. We also realized that we could never, we couldn't meet the need, we couldn't meet the demand for how many people were experimenting with psychedelics and then seeking to talk with a mental health care provider afterward. And I want to make it clear that I don't think everybody who uses a psychedelic in whatever setting they choose to use it in needs to talk to a therapist. But a lot of people want to. A lot of people do. And so we really wanted to make the move to start educating clinicians, so that we could make clinicians who have this some sort of understanding about this topic area and education about this topic area accessible to more people. And that's really why we started teaching with a focus on training clinicians. In 2018, actually, we began our first workshop together, and that evolved into our work with Fluence.
And so you also wrote an article for Shakruna about doing psychedelic integration in the context of group therapy. And so I
Yes.
was what that looks like in practice. And do you find people that might prefer processing this stuff in the context of a group, even over individual support?
Mm. So group therapy is really interesting, right? It kind of creates its own unique set and setting. Um, and we thought it would be really interesting. We were doing, integration work with people, mostly one-on-one, right? And we thought it would be really interesting to do that work in the context of the set and setting of a psychotherapy group. And when I say we, I'm really referring to my colleague Ingmar, and then our leading clinician team, Andrew Tatarski, and the other leading clinicians at the Center for Optimal Living, because that's where that group was when I ran it. I was working there. Center for Optimal Living had a program called the Psychedelic Education and Continuing Care Program, and that was a program that both Ingmar and I had director roles in for a while before we started Fluence. So the idea was to practice the kind of integration therapy that we were practicing in individual sessions, but bring it into a group psychotherapy setting. So in a group psychotherapy setting, you've got a different set of dynamics, different set of social parameters. You've got a whole set of relationships, both between the therapist and the participants, but also between the participants and each other. And it was a clinical a clinical try, like try this out and see how it works. And my sense is that it's certainly feasible to do it that way. That there are some unique benefits that people can get just from participating in a group psychotherapy, and then having that place that is specific to being able to talk about their psychedelic experiences as well. So, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, and I would probably know if this had happened, this isn't something that has been developed in clinical research trials and studied as a specific intervention, but it was a clinical case experiment of one, if you could say such a thing, to try this really in clinical practice. So I wrote that up just to kind of put it on the radar that this is something that I had tried. And it's interesting, several people have contacted me about it over the years, clinicians, and said, "Oh, yeah, I'm trying to do something like that. What do you think? How could I kind of get something like that going?" And maybe it will become a more solid part of the repertoire when when there are more people who have had maybe psychedelic therapy experiences and then want to do some longer term integration work and are able to do so in a group psychotherapy setting. I don't know, but I think it's a very valuable idea to continue to explore.
Yes. And thank you for writing those. I've had a number of friends who came to your sessions, and I've just heard so many good things about how it felt and the
Mm.
context of these. And to me, it makes so much sense as well, because often in societies, psychedelic experiences are done together with your entire tribe around you.
Hmm.
And we have this need for processing around each other. I think 12 step is
Hmm.
a great people who don't know each other coming together and doing so much good. So it's really great to hear about the thinking behind bringing people together to talk about their psychedelic experiences with having a therapist there as a
Yeah.
referee, if you will.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm really really heartened and glad to hear that that you heard there was some benefit from it. There are also uh, apples and oranges here. There are also wonderful peer integration groups and open integration groups that are sort of drop-in groups that just anybody can go to. It's, I think, less common for there to be a psychedelic integration oriented psychotherapy group where you have a therapist and it's more of a closed group, so you got the same people coming every week, and so there's some distinction there, and it does by necessity create some barriers. People have to plan ahead, they have to sign up. There's a different fee system. It then becomes part of their healthcare as opposed to something that they can just sort of sign up as a drop-in activity. But there's also some real potential for benefit. So again, I see it as potentially one piece on a great menu of options. But I hope that more therapists will pursue creating such an option within their practices if they're practicing psychedelic integration therapy. It's a really cool thing to add.
Well, and one I might add for people listening who might be interested is there's a group called Psychedelics for Recovery that is a 12-step group that actually is okay with people using psychedelics. A lot of 12-step groups wouldn't be. And
Hmm.
so it's a place where you can go to peers for the kind of support that you're mentioning here. And it leads to the second and last question I wanted to ask you, which is balancing the harm reduction of, the potential minor negatives or major negatives from psychedelics with using them in substance abuse settings and to help people stop using other drugs that they might be having bigger harms with. So for people who are struggling with substance abuse and are intrigued by what you're talking about, what advice would you have about moving forward, about thinking about this, about looking towards what might be possible for them?
Mm, that's a really tough question, Lex. I just want to say, for anybody who's in that position, um, I wish we had better knowledge and better information and better data and more, even more available options right now. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of options that are available to people through mainstream mental health care practices, clinics, and providers, to be able to engage in any kind of psychedelic assisted treatment or recovery. So I understand that a lot of people are, turning to underground sources. Maybe they're traveling to retreat centers or things like that for treatment. And that's where an integration therapist who's trained in harm reduction can really be helpful in supporting the process. But in terms of our standards and our current research, we're not at a place to be able to say, with, I think, any clarity right now, what would be helpful and for whom and under what circumstances and in what ways. So we're hearing, I hear the anecdotal stories that are incredibly moving. I hear the experiences. People reach out to me. I hear experiences of wonderful recoveries. I hear experiences of things that didn't go so well. Our science is not at a place where we're really able to provide this right now as a treatment. It's not demonstrated in the way that we would need to have that safety data and to know like what kind of follow up and what kind of surrounding therapy one would need. So I really encourage working with a harm reduction informed psychedelic integration therapist if that's something that people want to, think about or consider doing on their own. But it's not being provided and it's not available, at least in the States at this point, as a treatment option.
That's an excellent lead into the last question, the big money fantasy question. So if we could land you a medium large grant, enough to run your own research center and maybe a couple of phase 3 trials, a good hefty chunk of federal change or donations from listeners to this show, what would be the research problems that you would most like to tackle and study?
Oh, wow. That's that's a big question.
Big grant. Think big.
As I started off saying, and I think this is actually a great place to come around to. I would really like to see more and better research dedicated to the use of like how we could develop therapies to work with people who are struggling with addiction. I think it's an area that is historically neglected and misunderstood. There are some specific barriers to getting research in that area approved and carrying it through and getting it the kind of support that it needs. So I think that if it was up to me to really design the program of research, I think that's an area that I'd be really interested in working with. A lot of the conversations about what to research and how to research it are really focused on what the research designing people and entities feel they can make the biggest impact on, raise enough money to actually fund, and show enough change and enough promise, or enough differences between the treatment group and the placebo group or the non-treated group to have an approval or have an indication, a use approval. An indication is the FDA term, and so that can get us really far because it can move us through these processes and these systems and actually help move us towards indication and approval for medical use. That is one thing. But at the same time, it can lead to the neglect of specific types of suffering and specific ways of working that might not be might not be the easier things to tackle. They might be sort of more stigmatized and therefore less attractive to funders, or they may be the kinds of things that don't feel like as sure of a bet for for people that are funding research and they want to they want to put their money behind things that they're more confident they'll be able to show an impact on, make an impact on. So if I had some free free grant funding and reign to do with it, I would want to focus on some of the indications that could more easily be maybe left out of that process or left out of the highest level priorities at this point.
Well, thank you. That gets me excited to watch your research as it comes out these next years. And I wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to share and for the work you do that's moving this psychedelic renaissance forward.
Yeah, no problem, Lex.
So Dr. Elizabeth Nielson, her group is Fluence. We'll have a link in the episode notes and as well to her Google Scholar page with her research and the Chacruna article. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and share more.
Thank you, Lex.
Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, check out pluscbdoil.com, listen on all the podcast platforms, or see us on YouTube. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code Lex Files for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com, and please follow the podcast on Twitter @The Lex Files Show, where I try to keep it fun. If you enjoyed this program, please give us a like on your favorite platform or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. Thank you to Tina Molnar and Jasmine Morris for the visuals, and the music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. Our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.